So, a virtue for St. Thomas Aquinas is a habit in the soul that is oriented to the perfection of the soul's operations. A virtue enables the human person to live a good life. How are these virtues related to our interior life, to the way in which we actualize ourselves as human persons in the world? I am going to ground my articulation of the way in which virtue directs the soul's faculties to a supernatural end through a reading of the 16th century mystic and theologian and doctor of the Church, St. John of the Cross, or San Juan de la Cruz. St. John of the Cross is one of the great spiritual masters of our Catholic tradition. I'm going to focus on some key aspects of his great unfinished work, The Ascent of Mount Carmel. All of St. John of the Cross's works can be found in this great and classic translation of the major works, which were published by the Institute of Carmelite Studies. St. John of the Cross articulates the way in which faith, hope, and charity perfect the faculties of the human soul. So I'm going to break this down very briefly, and I'm going to explain the sources that St. John of the Cross is drawing upon. So St. John of the Cross articulates three key faculties of the human soul: the intellect, the memory, and the will. So he's getting this broadly from St. Augustine, especially St. Augustine's De Trinitate, where he says that intellect, memory, and will constitute a trinity within the soul, a kind of intra-trinitarian structure. Now, St. Thomas Aquinas does talk about the memory, though St. Thomas Aquinas is going to talk about specifically the intellect and the will. The intellect, that through which knowledge proceeds, and the will, that through which love proceeds. And the procession of knowledge and the procession of love participate in and imitate the intra-trinitarian life. The Son proceeds from the Father as a word, and the Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son as love, and also as gift. Now, St. John of the Cross synthesizes, in many ways, the Augustinian intra-trinitarian structure of the human soul as composed of memory, intellect, and will, and the Thomistic, that is to say from Thomas Aquinas, the Thomistic understanding of the human soul as having a particular structure grounded in experience, and then moving to concepts and willing according to the objects known by the intellect. So St. John of the Cross articulates the theological virtues as transforming the way in which intellect, memory, and will operate in our souls. The theological virtues almost invert the typical manner in which those operations and those faculties actualize themselves. So all of this takes place in what St. John of the Cross calls the active night. The active night is the purification of the soul as it ascends to God through prayer. It is the purification of the soul from the soul's perspective. So what's happening in the soul? What is happening in the interior life as God transforms it? So he talks about in the Ascent of Mount Carmel, in this active night, a distinction between two kinds of night. So the first is the night of the senses, the dark night of the senses. And the second is the dark night of the spirit, which is what we're talking about here. The dark night of the senses comes first. That's where our inordinate attachment to things in the world is purified. We have to purify our sensible attachments to creatures. And by purifying those attachments, we can move to the next stage, which is the purification of our interior spirit, of those faculties I talked about. So intellect, memory, and will. Faith purifies the intellect in such a way that the intellect receives truths that it could never possibly know through experience. So the normal way in which the intellect operates is we experience things in the world and we generate concepts on the basis of that experience. But faith inverts that completely. The truths pertaining to God, the supernatural truths of the divine life, cannot be known by experience because there's an infinite distance between creatures and God. So therefore, because we cannot know God ultimately as he is through creatures, we have to purify the concepts that are derived from experience. And God infuses within us propositions and truths that can only be known through faith. So God plants, if you will, in our passive intellect, so the kind of reservoir in our soul of concepts, the truths pertaining to, for example, the Trinity, the incarnation. Faith is a kind of knowing by unknowing. It enables us to know that which we cannot otherwise know through experience. And therefore, it's a dark night of our conceptual life, because it darkens everything that we could have conceptualized before. Just as the dark night of the senses transforms our experience, the way in which we experience the world, the dark night of the soul with respect to the intellect purifies the way in which we even conceptualize reality, particularly in relation to God. Now, the second virtue, which is hope, purifies the memory. How does hope purify the memory? Well, for St. John of the Cross, in order to have hope in God, in order to have hope in a reality that transcends all of our experience, we have to purify the things that we remember. We have to have a kind of internal forgetting of the past, of ourselves, and we have to direct our attention to God solely. So the whole focus is on the supernatural life working within us and perfecting us and directing us to a life that participates fully in the reality of the intertrinitarian life. In order to do that, we have to have a kind of amnesia, a kind of forgetting, and we have to look toward instead the life that transcends our creaturely existence. Finally, charity. Charity perfects the will. So the will proceeds from the intellect in the order of the soul's operations and ultimately directs itself to the good through our participation in the truths known by the intellect. So charity directs our will solely to God. It directs our will entirely to God and not to any creatures. So faith, hope, and love perfect our faculties. They direct us to that which we cannot possibly attain on our own. And in addition, they transform us entirely. The theological virtues build upon our nature and transform our nature, but our nature cannot do the things that the theological virtues through sanctifying grace do to us as we grow in prayer, as we grow in our life of purification. The Christian life is not something extrinsic. It's not something that you merely do on Sundays. It is not something that's primarily cultural or political or geographical. It is that by which we participate through Jesus Christ in the Holy Spirit who draws us to the Father.